Louis Armstrong has a song called Mahogany Hall Stomp. And you can just hear in this song just the dance of it. That goes.
Improvisation, of course, exists before jazz. Beethoven was a celebrated improviser. Bach's theme and variations are developed improvisationally, but you can't document improvisation. You can only document the finished work which exists on a score, which is written. There's no way of taping Beethoven's improvisation and then transcribing it. But Armstrong and jazz comes along at the same time as a technology that can document. Now, at first, there's naturally a prejudice because it's a written culture. We're prejudiced against an oral culture. But Armstrong, in those 1926 and 1927 and 8 performances, proves for the first time that an improvisation can be just as coherent, imaginative, emotionally satisfying, and durable as a written piece of music.
Between 1925 and 1928, Louis Armstrong made a series of 65 recordings under his own name. He was paid $50 a side and never saw a dime in royalties. But after they were released, jazz music would never be the same again, and generations of musicians would study them in wonder and admiration. His bands, the Hot 5 and Hot 7 and Savoy Ballroom 5, were recording groups only, mostly made up of New Orleans musicians with whom he'd been playing all his life, including Johnny Dodds, Johnny St. Cyr, and Kid Ory. His wife Lil often played the piano. But these records were something altogether new.
I think the most important thing that you can say about the Hot 5s and the Hot 7s is that for the first time we know that jazz is an art. What does he bring to this music that has not previously existed? First of all, he establishes almost single-handedly that jazz is going to be a soloist art, not an ensemble music. Number two, he affirms for all time that a fundamental basis for this music is going to be a blues tonality, which is going to be as fundamental to jazz as the tempered scale is to Western music. It's the blood, it's the life of the music. Third and most significant, and I think this is maybe the great innovation in American music, and it's the most astonishing to contemplate. Armstrong invented what, for lack of a more specific phrase, we call swing. He created modern time. The music that Armstrong improvised in 1928 excites us today. And if that's not classical music, I don't know what is.
For more than 2 years, Armstrong had been headlining at a South Side Chicago club, the Sunset. It was a tough place, run by the mob, and raided so often by the police, one musician remembered, that he used to run for the panty wagon as soon as it pulled up in order to get a good seat. Armstrong's pianist was a young musician from Pittsburgh, Earl Hines, who was an innovator in his own right. He played what came to be called trumpet-style piano, confidently spinning out complex, horn-like melodies with his right hand, while setting a looser rhythm with his left. He and Armstrong were rivals as well as friends. Each spurred the other to greater heights.
I went to Chicago. I made a pilgrimage. I took a week off and went up to Chicago. I had a little car, and I found my way to a place called the Savoy. And I sat on a rug-covered bandstand and waited, and he came on. And the first thing he played was West End blues. And I heard this cascade of notes coming out of a trumpet. No one had ever done that before. And so I was obsessed with the idea that this was what you had to do, something that was your own, that had nothing to do with anybody else. But I was influenced by him, not in terms of notes, but in terms of the idea of doing what you are, who you are.
On June 28, 1928, Louis Armstrong and Earl Hines went into the studio and recorded a King Oliver tune, West End Blues. It would become one of the best-known recordings in the history of jazz, a perfect reflection of the country in the moments before the Great Depression. And it would once and for all establish Louis Armstrong as the first great solo genius of the music.
When I was 15, I bought a copy of Louis Armstrong and Earl Hines. And I put it on, and the first track was Basin Street Blues, and I was so astounded by that that I had to take the needle off the record and just kind of get my breath. It took me about 6 months to get through the whole side of the record, you know, memorizing and learning each track before I would go on to the next one. And was no doubt in my mind that Armstrong was, you know, just the greatest figure in contemporary music, and where could he go beyond that? And then I turned the album over after some 6 months, and the first track is, you hear that cadenza, ba 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 boo da boo da ba boo da boo doo bee boo doo bee boo doo bee boo doo bee, West End Blues.
Trumpet players all throughout history, we always play fanfares. You know, you can start with the elephant. The elephant goes, that's like a fanfare. Get out of my way. I'm coming through. And from that, you have these like trumpet calls that you've heard all the time on the Saturday movies, like little things like that. And in Beethoven Lenore Overture, you have a trumpet call like so you always hear the trumpet doing that. Now the West End Blues go. So that's like another whole concept of a fanfare. And Armstrong goes into two different times, and he uses the same arpeggios, then he uses all these chromatic notes, and he uses the sound of the blues. It's like everything is in there. But it's so natural, it sounds very simple. But let me tell you, it's hard to get that D, too. And when you hear him play it, it's so just the brilliance of it, but also how natural it is. It's just like, okay, here's West End Blues for you.
I played West End Blues once for a music professor, and I put it on the turntable, and we played it once, and he said, play that again. We played it again in complete silence, and he said, I think that may be the most perfect 3 minutes of music I've ever heard in my life.
What